evening about the government's white paper on industrial strategy and ask the question, what or who is industrial strategy for? I'll just give you the references that are important for this in case you want to look them up. I haven't realized that I don't have the reference to my piece, so I would have put it there.
We'll circulate the link.
But anyway, the white paper is at the top, and then I'm going to use a fascinating document from 1928 called Britain's Industrial Future for comparative purposes. I was going to look carefully at the IPPR's recent document as well, but it turned out that was overloading the pudding, so to speak, and myself as well. So the reference is just there for you to look it up if you want. It's a very, very good document, and I very strongly recommend it. Indeed, what struck me after rereading it the other day was how similar it is to the 1928 document, although they don't cite it, and I don't think that anybody knew about the 1928 document. But I'll explore that one day. Anyway, the main point is to ask what the white paper tells us about the government's thinking on industrial strategy, and in particular, what or who is it for? Now, as Henry said, for a long time, industrial strategy had a bad press, to put it mildly. People would sneer about picking winners, which it was widely assumed government was completely incapable of doing. I'm not too sure that the private sector picks winners all that well, but that's another issue altogether. This attitude goes along with the resurgence of laissez-faire and neoliberal policies, which regard government as a kind of nuisance. And the theoretical background that they use for support of this view is based on an economic model which all economists are brought up on, which assumes that all the participants in the market have full knowledge of everything that is relevant to what they're doing from now till kingdom come. And so it's perfectly obvious, isn't it, that the government can't make things any better. This knowledge assumption of perfect knowledge, is, needless to say, never mentioned. And without it, the whole argument falls. Now, the resurgence of interest in industrial strategy coincided with the coalition government and with the end of the financial crash. And with it has come some discussion of what it means to say that you're doing something for the public good. Keynes has this lovely little quote, and you're supposed to substitute in your mind for the City of London economists and politicians. I'll do that. To suggest social action for the public good to economists and politicians is like discussing the origin of species with a bishop 60 years ago. And orthodoxy is in question. And the more persuasive the argument, the greater the offence. And that was the extent to which any idea of public policy for the public good, or industrial policy for the public good, Part of what is at issue is how the role of government is perceived. Again, following on this idea that market participants have perfect knowledge, mainstream economists imagine that there's this thing called the economy, which the government is outside of and does things to, injects new money or some demand to rectify some deficiency in how the economy is functioning. The alternative view, which particularly Mariana Mazzucato has championed, is that government and business are partners. Governments make markets, or at least make markets possible. Where would markets be without the law of contract and courts to enforce that law? And so on. So that the conflict between market and government that so characterizes the discussion of these matters is, in Mariana's view, an utterly false one, point of view, which I thoroughly agree, and Josh is working for her, so I guess he will too. So we come back to this idea of asking what the industrial strategy should be for. In the 1928 document, well, no, let me talk about the 1928 document. It's not a document, it's a book. Here it is. It is known as the Yellow Book, for obvious reasons. It was written by a group of people who called themselves the Liberal Industrial Inquiry on behalf of the Liberal Party, and it had some of the best brains in England working on it, including Walter Lakeland, who was the editor of The Economist at the time, David Lloyd George, Maynard Keynes, Dennis Robertson, you name them, they're all busy on this effort. And it took about 2 years to research and put together. The outstanding thing about that document is that they pay attention to this question of what for, and state clearly their philosophy. I'm sorry. I know it's confused. Here we are. Their philosophy is that democracy exists to remedy grievances and to create conditions in which all have the opportunity to live a full and free life. And they identified the main grievances at the time as economic in nature, and mentioned particularly a wide disparity of incomes, widespread un- and underemployment, and low wages, which I forgot to mention, and poor housing. Nothing much has changed. So it might be more pertinent than you think, even though the book is 90 years old. And they restate their philosophy at the end of the introduction. We believe, and I'll skip the middle, we believe with a passionate faith that the end of all political and economic action is that individual men and women may have life and that they may have it more abundantly. Now that's a very noble statement and a very clear statement of the primacy of the people in an economy for whom an industrial strategy is to be undertaken. By contrast, purpose in the white paper has to be inferred. It's between the lines that you have to read. The nearest thing to a discussion of purpose in the white paper is what they call their vision statement. It is, notice, entirely in economic terms. Our vision, they write, and never mind the grammar, which is terrible. Our vision is for the world's most innovative economy, good jobs and greater earning power for all, a major upgrade to the UK's infrastructure, the best place to start and grow a business, and prosperous communities across the United Kingdom. Well, it's a sort of list, and indeed, the contrast between the 1928 document, which is a document entailing serious research and consideration of how to fix the perceived inadequacies of the British economy, and the white paper, which reads like a shopping list, will become evident, I think, as we go along. So they don't have a single purpose, they have a series of purposes, and those purposes are entirely economic. Some good friends of mine recently wrote a book for whose title they invented a word, econocracy. Ocracy, of course, refers to rule. In democracy, you're ruled by the people, and a kleptocracy by thieves, autocracy by a single person, and now we're ruled by the economy. And I would argue that the white paper is econocracy in action. And this is quite clear in this vision statement. The idea of industrial strategy, the aim of industrial strategy, as specified in the white paper, is to enable firms to be successful, to boost their profitability. And they perceive that the keys to that success are competition, open financial markets, and the profit motive. I want to say just a few words about each of those, if I may. Again, they place all the emphasis that it's possible to place on the role of competition in regulating industrial success. By contrast, the authors of the Yellow Book are very skeptical about the role of competition. The theory that private competition, unregulated and unaided, will work out with certainty to the greatest advantage of the community is found by experience to be far from the truth. So somewhere along the line, the economists have persuaded the politicians that their model in which competition solves all the economy's woes, which is based on an economy of small firms who can't, by their own actions, influence markets. This is the basis, the theoretical basis of this point of view. The worst place to rely on competition to solve all the world's woes is in the financial sector. And I would attribute the rise to prominence of competition in the financial sector, attribute to that rise the financial crash, without a doubt. I think the financial crash started in 1971 with competition and credit control, which freed up competition between the banks and the building societies. Now what do banks do? They finance mortgages. That was thought to be unsuitable for firms that got their funding from sight deposits. The maturity mismatch was too great. The financial competition has spread throughout the financial sector and globally, of course, and has left the drive to maintain profits under these very challenging competitive conditions to all kinds of unsafe practices, a high level of leverage, the innovation of financial products which are themselves unsafe, and so on. Finally, there is the matter of the profit motive, which again attracted some attention from the writers of the Yellow Book. Keynes always was extremely clear that in the matter of public policy and doing something for the public good, the profit motive was a very bad guide. He spoke of the criterion of action within their field solely being the public good as they understand it, as the best attribute of the public corporation as it had been developed in England at that time. So here were private institutions acting in the public interest, not in the private interest, and not entirely geared to the maximization of profit. He gave examples, you can read them. Corporate organization has changed completely since that was written. Shareholder value as the aim of company behavior has been elevated to the priority that we now see, which causes firms to think in very short-term time horizons and engage in all kinds of practices which will increase short-term profit at the expense of the long-term survival of the business, including practices of competition which are unethical and even illegal, as we know. We've had plenty of examples in recent years. So there are three cornerstones of the key to profitability and the key to industrial success. Each one seems to me to be challengeable and has been challenged by articulate people who may have written quite some time ago but deserve our attention. Now, I said at the beginning that the white paper read like a shopping list, and please do if you have. Thank you. And they organized this shopping list by categories with rather juvenile names attached to it. Ideas, people, infrastructure, business environment, places. Each one following the line of their original business vision statement. And then the document lists all kinds of initiatives with this amount of money going here and that amount of money going there, and each one requiring the institution of some body which will oversee the distribution and use of the funds, so that you have this proliferation of schemes. I counted 80 over a fairly short number of pages, and I was halfway through when I gave up. So you see what I mean by a shopping list, and if you want to know exactly where they were directing their money, and you have the patience to read that kind of stuff, I recommend you do that. But broadly speaking, they will support research and development and innovation, particularly green technology. They will invest in education, particularly directed toward the STEM subjects. They want to improve transport, housing, and digital infrastructure. And they want to make it a good place to start up new businesses, promote cooperation between business, government, and universities, and address productivity problems in the small and medium-sized businesses. And place, of course, refers to regional policy, about which they're rather intelligent. So it's not all bad, this, but it doesn't answer the question that I raised at the beginning: what or who is it for? Primacy is entirely, as I hope I've illustrated, geared to profitability of existing and new business. On the existing business front, they're very keen to support and encourage those businesses that are already viewed as successful: aerospace, motor car industry, or automotive industry generally, and then turn their mind toward encouraging the application of innovative ideas and bringing those ideas to fruition, particularly keen on driverless cars and things like that. They end up summarizing their ideas in 4 grand challenges. They pledge their word to put the UK at the forefront of artificial intelligence and the data revolution, maximize the advantages for UK industry from the global shift to clean growth, to become a world leader in shaping the future of mobility, and to harness the power of innovation to help meet the needs of an aging society. Somebody should tell them it's not the society that's aging, it's the population. That's just symptomatic of a kind of difficulty with the writing which I have. It's not the most elegant document. Now, I see all these challenges as viewing the world through the wrong end of the telescope. Look at them carefully. They advocate AI, artificial intelligence, not because robots can relieve us of dreary jobs, but to be first. Do you remember when it was very fashionable for countries to have vanity projects to fly the flag, whether it was their own airline, going to the moon, all this kind of stuff. They want to be first, show off. They want clean growth, and they're good about clean growth, and the technology required therefore. not for the sake of clean air or clean water, never mind saving the planet, but to help business firms capture the gains from being in the forefront of green technology. They don't use the word green, they use the word clean, because green is too left-wing. They want to foster mobility, not to make it easier for people to get about, but to be a world leader in the future trajectory of its technology. If we go back and look at that, I'm sorry, Sue, I'm interrupting your writing, but would you go back? If you look at those 4 grand challenges again, just think about them for a moment. They're all the wrong way up. So that's my take on the white paper. I don't think much of it, although there are some redeeming features, obviously. Can't be all bad. My main objection is that they have forgotten altogether the role of the population that governments are ostensibly elected to serve. That's us. Instead, the people, us, are there to serve the economy. We're to become more productive, so that the business community can make better profits. And the business community is to be successful because it looks good for government. It helps aggrandize the state. So the whole thing, instead of the state serving industry by participating and helping it along, in order that industry might provide us with some of the tools for the good life, it's all upside down. Now that is a very depressing little view of the modern approach to industrial strategy. It stands in very sharp contrast to what was said in 1928, whose philosophy started with giving people a good life and a more abundant good life. Incidentally, did anybody recognize where that quote came from? I'll just read it to you again. See if you can identify it. If I can find it. We believe with a passionate faith that the end of all politics and economic action is that individual men and women may have life, and that they may have it more abundantly. It's a paraphrase, not a quote. I misspoke. Anybody recognize it? No, we saw it. Jesus Christ. Just my case.
Josh, over to you.
Thank you, Vicky.
Erudite and Liverpool measure. Thanks very much, Henry, for inviting me today. So, as Henry mentioned, I'm head of research at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. We're a relatively new department in the Bartlett at UCL, founded by Mariana Mazzucato in autumn 2017, so we're quite new on the block. But our key research and policy influencing area for us is industrial policy. So very, very pleased to come and talk to you today. What I'm going to talk about is the conventional sort of economics view on the role of industrial policy. And then I'm going to, which Vicky's already done to some extent, so I won't spend too much time on it, but then I'm going to talk about how we propose, essentially, industrial policy, and more generally innovation, actually, should be done by governments and advanced economies, and how to give it this public purpose, which of course is part of our name. So we should know how to do it. So as Vicky was saying, the conventional kind of view of the role of the state in economic development and driving economic growth is a sort of secondary role. The primary role is the role of the market, and the market kind of exists out there. It can operate sort of by itself, and the efficient markets hypothesis essentially says that where you have perfect or close to perfect levels of competition and information, you get the most efficient outcomes. And the government's role should be to try and help create those conditions, and the state should intervene by sort of setting the rules of the game, making the rules fair, by de-risking, enabling, facilitating market activity and competition and better information. And essentially one can sort of sum this up really as sort of a market fixing type approach, so fixing market failures. We just go to the next slide. And these are some of the classic examples really of this sort of what Mariana's calls sort of sticking plaster approach into the sort of market fixing. So there are, there's many different types of market failure. I mean, there's a whole literature on market failure in sort of conventional economics. One of them is coordination failures. Typically, this is a role for fiscal policy. We should spend more at a time when the market is not well coordinated to prevent too much pro-cyclical activity. The better known ones are public goods, where essentially there is no market, there's no, you don't get any money for creating clean air, so there's a role for the government to step in. Negative externalities such as pollution. Information failures, where there isn't sufficient information in the market, so there's a justification for example, supporting finance for SMEs, because banks can't get enough information about them to know whether to make a loan, and imperfect competition, which Vicky's talked about already. Just move on. None of these sort of market failure, market fixing approaches are very helpful though when it comes to actually understanding the really radical innovations and technological breakthroughs that we're enjoying most today, such as the internet, for example. The internet was not a result of anyone spotting a market failure and then taking some step in order to correct that market failure. I mean, maybe you could say there was a lack of information, and thus we needed the internet, but I don't quite think that's the type of failure that we're talking about here. No, that's not how these types of innovation actually happen. They are all the result of much more complex and dynamic interactions between the state and the market, and I will come on to talk about that. But one consequence of this sort of the secondary role for the state only intervening where there is a clear market failure is actually we've seen a big fall in investment, public and private investment. One might say that as the state pulls back, the typical free market sort of neoliberal argument, as the state pulls back, the private sector steps in to fill the gap which the state has been inefficiently spending. No, quite the opposite actually. As the state has pulled back from public investment, the private sector has essentially followed it. And you can see there this general fall in public and private investment. I think this is capital investment as a percentage of GDP in the advanced economies where this type of philosophy has become predominant. And then you can see one major exception in the shape of China, where of course they have quite a different philosophy towards state investment and industrial policy, where the state still has a very, very strong proactive approach to industrial policy. And that in that place, the investment has gone up. So what we would argue essentially is that the state, as Vicky was saying, that the state has and always has had, actually, we should have, a market shaping as well as a market fixing role. That actually economic growth has, as well as having a rate, 2%, 3%, 4% GDP, actually has a direction. And that direction, whether it's a green direction, whether it's a direction that increases or reduces inequality, whether it's a direction that creates jobs or destroys them, is set by, importantly, partially by the state. And if the state steps back from that market shaping role, the consequences can be a direction of growth that is not necessarily optimal for welfare. This is a quote from Karl Polanyi, who is quite influential in our thinking here. The road to free markets was opened and kept open by an enormous increase in continuous, centrally organised and controlled interventionism. Administrators had to be constantly on the watch to ensure the free working of the system. So actually it was the state that created free markets rather than the state that's constantly destroying their efficiency. And this is a nice quote from Keynes. The important thing for government is not to do the things which individuals are doing already, and to do them a little bit better or a little worse, this sort of incremental, marginalist approach to economics, but to do things which at present are not done at all. And that's that sort of radical innovation that I was just talking about. So if we move on. Now, the nature of innovation is highly uncertain. And this is why we do need the states, we do need the public sector to play a role. Innovation, essentially new combinations of technologies, of goods and services, of ideas, of knowledge, is highly unpredictable. You don't know in advance. We didn't know in advance that the internet would be created. It was the outcome of the US Defense R&D agency, DARPA, spending millions and millions of dollars on all kinds of advanced experiments, essentially, to help soldiers in the field communicate with each other at large distances. That was, and the outcome was the internet, right? Along with some other important technological developments. We didn't know in advance that would happen. For every Tesla, there is another company, Cylindro is the example that's often pointed to, which has had huge amounts of public R&D poured into it, that failed, right? They were about the same size in the sort of late 1990s, and they both had massive grants from the US government. One succeeded, one failed. So you don't know in advance what's going to work and what's not going to work. And of course, that means that it's very hard for the private sector to take big risks, particularly in that early stage R&D, research and development, high risk capital. And that is a key role for the state. So rather than being a lender of last resort, a la Bank of England, propping up the system when it goes wrong, actually the state needs to play a role of being investor of first resort, leading the way, taking the risk, bringing the private sector with it, doing experiments to support these kinds of radical breakthroughs. And that is often forgotten, I think, in modern discussions. If we just go forward, this is an attempt to kind of just trace the innovation chain and where investment occurs. This is based on the US. It's across lots of different sectors. But you see public on the bottom, private at the top there. R&D, basic research, R&D research, the US has these huge organizations. DARPA is the defense, I think it's the National Institute for Health, the National Science Foundation. These organizations pouring billions of dollars into very early stage research and development, often working with universities at a much, much larger scale than the private sector does, actually. The private sector comes in a little bit later, where you kind of have angel investors, technology labs, but you know, they're best known really for coming in at the sort of venture capital, particularly in the US and Silicon Valley, coming in around the product development stage before, rather after the concept itself, the idea has been developed. And then, of course, when it comes to production and marketing, one can make an argument that the private sector probably is better equipped than the public sector. But there is multiple stages where the public sector plays a key role, also in product development, actually. Again, in the US, the same type of organisations play a really important role. So if we just move forward. Now, what does all this mean in terms of industrial policy? Well, we would argue that what we need is what we call a mission-oriented industrial policy that is characterised by a focus on public purpose. Now, traditional industrial policy involves what's called horizontal and vertical policies. Horizontal policies typically cut across sectors, and they're often focused on supply-side issues such as, have people got enough skills to survive in the globalised world and adapt to the challenge of China, etc., etc. But vertical policies tend to get more attention. But vertical policies tend to be basically focused on particular sectors or particular technologies and how we support them. And Vicky, I think, took us through the UK industrial policy white paper, making clear that this sector focus is very strong. However, what we're actually dealing with in modern advanced economies are challenges which actually don't conform to that sort of horizontal and vertical approach at all. We're talking about things like decarbonising the economy, massive structural changes to the economy, or dealing with an ageing society, right, or rising inequality. These are issues actually which are sort of sector blind. They don't really care about sectors. They are massive challenges. If we just go forward one, you can see the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN developed. Still quite a good, if rather long, list. But none of these challenges, what have we got here? Responsible consumption, production, clean water, reducing inequality, decent work and economic growth. I mean, these are not things that you can just sort of whittle down to being a simple sectoral problem or a sort of skills problem, right? They're much broader than that. If we just go back one slide. So instead of focusing on sectors, the argument is that you take that big challenge, and then within that challenge, you think about particular objectives or missions, basically, to help achieve help deal with that challenge. So mission-oriented policy is about stimulating organisations from all sectors, whether it's public, private, or third sector, to engage with the investment and the activities that such challenges require. This is market shaping. And so this kind of vertical policy focused on missions is about saying, this is the problem, are you with us or not? And if you're not with us, we're not interested in you, we're not going to fund you, right? It's not about saying, this sector, the car sector or, whichever sector it might be, will make us the world leader in this market, and then we'll have more money, right? Because that does nothing to actually solve the problem of climate change. So it's about picking the willing rather than picking winners. And this gets you round this great sort of critique that's always made against industrial policy, that it supports vested interests and the government gets in bed with certain vested interests in certain corporations. You cut through that with this sort of missions type approach. So I'll just sort of run through an example of this if you go forward to. This is a sort of map that we sort of use here. You've got your grand challenge, let's say it's decarbonising the economy. Then you develop clear targeted missions that should be realistic, people should be able to understand what they are. And you do that, you develop those missions not just on your own, in the ivory tower of Whitehall, but actually by engaging with civil society, it should be democratically influenced, because otherwise it won't have legitimacy and it will be subject to just being reversed by the next government that comes along, essentially. So this needs to be a highly participative, co-produced sort of approach to what those missions should look like. And then out of those, once those missions have been established, you develop a portfolio of projects and you try and encourage bottom-up experimentation. So you don't you don't specify exactly what the project will be to hit that mission. You just say, this is the mission. You tell us how you're going to achieve that mission, and we may or may not give you some money according to how close we think that will achieve that mission. That's the criteria. If we go forward one, I'll just talk through how we've tried to do this with the European Union. Mariana has been advising Carlos Moedas, who's the Commissioner on Research and Development in the EU, which has quite a large R&D fund called Horizon 2020. And this is one example from this publication which talks about climate change. So climate change is the grand challenge that we're facing. The mission that we sort of came up with was 100 carbon neutral cities across Europe by 2030, reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions balance of 100 European cities by 2030. Then you've got your sectors, and of course it's not just one sector, it's a whole load of sectors when you're dealing with decarbonisation. It's real estate, it's the energy sector obviously, it's also mobility, transport, it's environment, it's materials, it's behavioural issues, it's food and agriculture. And then you think about the projects, the research and investment projects, research and innovation projects. So, for example, buildings with carbon-absorbing components, clean urban electric mobility, carbon-neutral urban food industry connecting cities to regions, citizen carbon ID, e-government streamlining of carbon footprints. And what you try and do is get these projects interacting with each other, complementing each other, and feeding back into that mission. So it's a sort of iterative, quite messy process, but ultimately it's driven by the mission. And we've got a couple of other examples in that. You can download this online if you're interested. We've got a couple of examples like cleaning the oceans, and there's one around mobility, I believe. If we just move forward then, I will skip the UK industrial strategy because Vicky's talked about it extensively. We have been trying to advise Theresa May and the Conservative government on their industrial strategy, and they have come up with some sort of missions. They haven't put the type of investment into them that we were hoping, but at least they took a step in the right direction. But what criteria should you use for selecting missions? This is what we think: a clear direction that engages the public and is clearly cross-sectoral. They need to be targeted, measurable, time-bound. So you actually put a date for when you want to achieve that to create focus. Ambitious but realistic, and as I said, cross-disciplinary. And missions should, as I said, not specify how to achieve success. They pick the problem and they encourage solutions by stimulating cross-actor activity to address those problems. And if we go forward, how do you implement missions? You select by engaging with the public, as I mentioned, and you focus on milestones and targets that are focused on impact. And the other important thing, I think, is that you accept some experiments will fail. You accept that risk, you accept what you're doing is risky, and you accept failure, and you learn from it, right? You don't beat people up because they didn't deliver what you funded them to do. You say, what can we learn from this to make better investments going forward? Okay, I'm going to talk, that's industrial strategy broadly. I want to talk about finance as well, because I think this is a sort of bit of the elephant in the room, particularly in the UK, around industrial policy, and Vicky's already alluded to it in her presentation. But from a heterodox pluralist economics perspective, I'm a big fan of Joseph Schumpeter's work on finance and how it interacts with innovation. Basically, what Schumpeter argued was that that bank credit creation, bank lending, is actually at the heart of innovation and capitalist production and dynamism, because when a bank makes a loan, it doesn't actually take money from anywhere else in the economy. It creates new purchasing power. It expands its balance sheet, its assets and its liabilities. And that means that even if you're quite a small business without any profits to reinvest, you can actually get new money to draw on existing resources within the economy and make those new combinations that actually can create innovation and can challenge incumbents and actually create new steps forward. So actually the role of banks and bank credit is absolutely key. But of course, banks don't have to lend in ways that support productive innovation or support missions. And obviously, if we move forward, they haven't been doing that essentially since the 1970s. This is a chart that from a recent paper that I co-authored with some colleagues, which shows total credit relative to GDP on the left-hand axis, which is the black line, expanding massively since 1970, from 60% of GDP up to 100%, so big increase in bank lending. But actually, the proportion of that lending that's actually supporting businesses for productive activity has fallen considerably. It's fallen from 60% to 40% of GDP. Most bank credit is flowing into real estate and it's flowing into existing financial assets, pumping up share prices, pumping up asset prices. And that is, this financialization process, which is why we have unaffordable houses, which is why we have excessive wealth inequality. And it's not supporting industrial policy, it's not supporting industrial strategy. The next slide just shows the UK picture since 1985. 1985, around 40% of bank lending, broadly speaking, was supporting productive activity, was supporting non-financial firms, the dark blue at the bottom. That's fallen to less than 10% of all bank lending last year, whereas we've seen this huge expansion in mortgage credit. That's the yellowy colour, as well as an expansion in the financial sector, which is the blue and the green on the top. So basically, the banking system is not supporting industrial policy or innovation. If we move forward, but that's a big problem, because if innovation is highly risky, if developing new technologies takes time, we need patient and long-term finance rather than the kind of short-term, low-risk finance that, for example, mortgage is, right? I mean, it's actually long-term but low risk, but the other sort of finance is often quite short-term. Type of finance businesses tend to be very, very short-term rather than sort of 3 to 5 years, which is what a firm that is actually doing something interesting typically will need. So actually we need different types of institutions for this. And if we move forward, the final kind of piece I was going to talk about was just IIPP's research on state investment banks, and we'll just skip forward to the next slide. Yeah, next one. We've been advising the Scottish government on the creation of a Scottish National Investment Bank, first sort of new major institution of this type in the UK for a long time, and we've done a couple of reports to try and make that happen. And what we've tried to do is basically give that Scottish National Investment Bank clear missions to guide its funding. Again, missions rather than sectors. I'll just quickly skip to my concluding slides. I'm running out of time. Yeah, next one, keep going. Next one. Yeah, much too long. Concluding points. The state can play a market shaping, not just market fixing role. We should focus on challenges, not on sectors, and those missions need to be supported through democratic processes. And credit and finance plays a really key role. We need different types of banks to do the kind of patient finance that is needed. The other final point I make, which I haven't really talked about, is I think we need to think carefully about the demand for the kind of capital investment that we need for a sensible industrial strategy. Government tends to focus a lot on the supply side. Are people, you've got enough skilled workers? Is there the right kind of finance? But actually, the contraction in fiscal policy and the lack of coordination between industrial policy, fiscal policy, and financial policy is a really big problem. We need the Treasury and the Bank of England and the Department for Industrial Policy to be working together, to both work out what the strategy is to finance it properly and not to finance the stuff we don't need. We need much more coordination. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Let's just put this off first. Try and find a way to switch it off. Yeah.
Not bad.
If in doubt, Paul. If you want to come forward, and we'll just come up.
All right.
Right. Right. Take a seat. Brilliant. Thanks very much. I have to say, I have worked on a mission. It's very exciting. So there has been influence from Josh's centre into all areas of government, which makes somewhat of a change for actually discussions we have at these events, where you can actually see that the influence actually is getting into government in part. Anyway, shall we then, who would like to start? And usually it's always said, of course, if the woman asks the first question, we have a much better discussion, but I don't want to put any pressure on them. But who'd like to ask the first question? Now. Yes.
To what extent have you researched the idea that taxation is actually an hindrance, and that the way we change our tax system could make a big difference to the productivity? I mean, I think, for example, infrastructure, there's the idea of value capture, because an infrastructure creates huge value, but the question who gets the value, if it went back to the backers, in the form of the government and the sort of strategy, they would be more or less self-financing. I don't know whether that's been looked at.
Josh, that's a big...
Do you want me to answer that straight off the bat?
Well, okay, we'll take a couple more. Okay, Andrew, do you want
to... green industrial strategy seems to be the holy grail that nations globally are looking for, with a mission dictated by the SDGs, as you've rightly pointed out. But the problem, surely, is the real difficulty in capturing these externalities into both industrial policy and accounting. How can that be done?
one more? Okay, we'll take one more. Okay, Chris.
Recently, there's been a move to prevent the government selling off RBS and making it into a mission-oriented bank, I believe. Have you taken any part in that?
Okay, so we've got, should we add some tax policy in? We've got externalities and, yes, turning RBS into a mission-oriented bank? Who'd like to? You don't have to answer all of them. Pick and choose.
Well, I'll answer the tax one. I'll go anyway. Yeah, I mean, I've written quite a bit about the land value capture issue, and I certainly think it should support industrial policy. And again, this is this coordination point. I think, you know, if the government wants a strong industrial strategy and policy with serious investment, it should be aligning the taxation system to support productive capital investment. Currently, the taxation system encourages investment into existing rather than new assets. It encourages us to save up lots of money, to get a massive mortgage, to buy a house, to inflate the value of land underneath that house, and then to withdraw equity from that value over time to fund doing up our kitchens and going on nice holidays. Right? That's not a productive kind of direction for the economy, and it's not supporting industrial policy. So taxation could play a really important role. If you tax land properly, if you have a land value tax, one would hope that that would shift the incentive of investors and households towards, for example, you know, buying shares in companies that were doing something useful, that weren't invested in land. So yeah, I would support that.
There are all sorts of aspects of a tax policy that could be altered in a way that would support a much more productive approach, I think. Not just one single tax, but a whole range of them, including business rates. I'd like to put in a plea for government to have the courage to tell RBS what to do. If they are a majority shareholder, I guess they're not majority shareholders anymore, are they? But they still are large, important shareholders.
I think they are still.
Well, whatever the
70%.
Whatever the facts of the case are, they're in a position to make a lot of noise toward telling RBS what they should be doing, and they have never had the courage to do it. I don't see the point in being a majority shareholder of anything if you're not prepared to exercise your rights. This, until we take shareholder value down a peg, let's exercise those rights.
As a sort of supplementary, I think both these areas would, of course, involve the Treasury believing in industrial policy. Is that a bit like believing that hell will freeze over?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Treasury is a major block on some of the stuff we've been talking about, somehow this sort of idealised version of neoclassical economics has sort of become embedded within the upper circles, I think, in the Treasury. I mean, I think what Labour is proposing is to kind of to create what's called a strategic investment board, where the Treasury and the Bank of England and industrial policy kind of have to work together on the big priorities for the day in terms of industrial policy, and that might be one way of trying to barge through that.
There's a marvellous little remark by Keynes to the effect, I have to paraphrase because I haven't got it absolutely straight in my head, but to the effect that what needs to change is the Treasury's understanding of the proper criterion for public action. So the vision of the Secretary of the Treasury, why the Secretary and not the Chancellor, I don't know, but anyway, that's what he said, as a kind of CEO of a joint stock company is a vision that has to change.
But if I may say, the HM Treasury has financed the Green Finance Institute. It's now put the money in. It's going to be launched on the 2nd of July.
You mean the City of London thing?
Yes. And the Treasury has got the Green Finance Strategy being published this spring. They're on the case here.
Very optimistic.
Very optimistic.
I mean, okay, but they are doing what the Chancellor committed to a year ago by putting government money in to this institute and into this strategy?
Yeah, I mean, it's all relative. I think that's the point. I mean, the German State Investment Bank, KfW, its assets are about 25% of German GDP. Right? The UK has, the UK Business Investment Bank is about 0.1% GDP. So, these things are relative, and it's quite easy for a government to look like it's doing something, but not actually be doing anything of any material significance. I mean, I think the other problem with the Treasury is it's the way they evaluate and appraise policies, which policies to go with, and which policies to take forward, and then how they're evaluated. So the Green Book, I think, is something we've been working on. It's a bit of a block to this. It tends to have this kind of what we call a sort of static notion of efficiency or allocative efficiency, where you essentially assume that all else is equal, and you look at a very narrow intervention in a narrow sector, and then assess the costs and benefits, assuming all other prices stay the same throughout the economy, basically. I mean, this is just how you work if you're in that neoclassical economics framing. Of course, the type of interventions we've been talking about, where you're decarbonising the economy, involve changing all the prices across the economy over potentially a long period of time, which makes that sort of cost-benefit analysis evaluation completely hopeless, right? It's not the way to do it. And it doesn't capture the spillover effects that you get from, say, that early-stage R&D investment that we saw in the internet. It's impossible to capture that with that sort of narrow evaluation approach.
But that's exactly what Claire Perry and the Green Growth Strategy is dedicated to doing.
But that's Bayes. That's a different, and there is a conflict and tension between Bayes and the Treasury, and actually influenced by
We've had some feisty workshops involving both parties talking about this.
But it is amazing, actually. There is actually a debate about this within government, between analysts, as to what are appropriate methodologies, approaches, and so on. So it is actually become a live issue. But Jo.
Where do you think the role is for central banks, and do you think there needs to be reform? Because if we rely on central bankers, they have a kind of viewpoint that we're living in an econocracy, like Vicky said. But then if we politicise them, we've got shorter term horizons, and we're kind of adherent to politicians. So is there a way forward?
There was at the back.
First, thanks both. I really enjoyed both.
Would you stand, please?
Of course, I can stand. So, one question. This is specifically to Josh. First, should mission-oriented innovation policy be applied in developing economies? And if so, is that appropriate given that precisely the reason of underdevelopment, one of them, is not already having cutting edge sectors and technologies all over Europe? You don't have a balanced economy, so the purpose of industrial strategy should be to develop that economy in one sense. If you don't already have cutting edge technology sectors, how can you approach this mission-oriented innovation policy?
Okay.
Productivity is usually used, or increased productivity is usually used to increase the profits of the company. What a pity it can't sometimes be used to reduce the selling price of the products. There was a reference on the radio I heard the other day to a construction company which is building private houses, which had a turnover of 4 billion, but had made a profit of 1 billion. And I think I heard that they'd given the chief executive a bonus of 100 billion. I mean, wouldn't it have been better if that organisation had sold their houses for 25% less? It's all making profits for the rich instead of spreading money around the society.
Okay, so we've got a role of politicisation of the central bank, mission-orientated industrial strategy in a developing country, and giving back money out of selling for less if successful.
Can I just pick up on this last one? I mean, one of the lovely things in the Yellow Book was the plea to regularize and institutionalize workers' share of profit. And they say, well, this may make the workers better off, it may increase output, but this is not the point. The point is to settle the principle on which the gains from production and output are shared across the economy. Okay, that's their principle. I'm not sure I remember correctly, but I don't think that this issue of distribution of gains is handled in the white paper at all. Good, okay. So I remember correctly. You would have told me if I hadn't, that's for sure. They've left it aside. There's a hangover of this laissez-faire atmosphere that has pervaded government and, of course, economics for the last 40 years in this. So this is a question of conscious policy about distribution of gains, which is going to become acute in the matter of robots, because it will be a question: who gets the rent from that innovation? It will become quite acute, I think. So it's a much more general. I mean, either the price of output can go down, or the workers can share adequately in the profit gain. If you look at what happened from, say, 1946 to 1970, the gains from growth were pretty reasonably shared between capital and labour, and then it broke down. So that really is the frame of reference. I think that your question belongs in. Thank you.
Josh, do you want to say?
Yeah, on the central bank's question, I think that's an interesting one. I've actually been making an argument recently looking at the role of central banks and financial regulators in dealing with the challenge of climate change and decarbonisation. I've actually made the inverse argument to the one you've just made to try and illustrate how you can sometimes turn things around in these kinds of debates. So the classic argument with if you start saying to central banks, you've got to lend to this sector or that green sectors, or you've got to start thinking about inequality. The classic response is, that's a political decision. If we become subject to political decisions, we will no longer be able to prevent inflation, and people will lose credibility in us. With climate change, what you're actually dealing with is a long-term problem that is too long-term for our politicians to be able to actually deal with, right? Because nobody wants to raise the carbon tax now, even though they know it makes sense in the long run, because they're too worried about losing votes. Now, climate change poses a serious financial stability risk because of this stranded assets problem. All of this fossil fuels needs to be kept in the ground, which means the asset values of hundreds of very expensive firms are wrong, basically. So the argument would be, actually, because central banks are independent of government, of politicians, they have a duty to act to try and decarbonise the economy in the long term, because politicians can't, or unable to, because of the democratic constraints. And if they choose not to act to try and prevent finance flowing into brown assets, then one asks, what's the point of you being independent, right? You may as well just become a public agency. So one can sort of flip that argument around. On the mission-oriented development argument, I don't see any reason. I mean, there's this idea that emerging or developing countries sort of need help from advanced economies, or need the technologies to mature before they can develop their own domestic industrial policy. I don't really buy that sort of. I'm not sure if that's quite what you were getting at. Okay, maybe you can just rephrase the question.
Is that precisely the point of being an emerging economy, not being an advanced economy,
Yeah.
in the tradition of Latin American structuralism, is to have this heterogeneous approach where you only have a few sectors basically that lead your economy, usually primary base.
Oh, I
And
see.
you don't have a whole basis, right? So if you engage in a strategy of mission-oriented innovation, you're actually missing, let's say, I don't know,
So
like
you,
nanotechnology sector. You don't have that, or whatever. So you end up with few vested interests in a few industries,
right.
and it's really hard to go out of that. It's not at all having to do with needing help from advanced economies.
Right. So you're saying a mission-oriented approach wouldn't work under those circumstances?
I'm saying it would be harder for it to work, and it would be quite subject to a lot of political, to vested interests too.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Can
Come
I
in, yeah.
come back to you on that one? Just with the question: is the problem of vested interests worse in less developed countries than in developed countries, and if so, why?
I might just add, because I think it's quite interesting, because industrial strategy obviously seems like a sort of non-political, technical, it's quite oftenly, but it is often talked about as if it's a technical thing. Whereas if you take an example of something that I have a work relationship with, so I won't have an opinion on it, of course, but if you go into read any newspaper, what can you do to reduce your carbon footprint? Stop eating meat, stop eating dairy. And so, you could have a mission to change our economy so that we don't have livestock. Now, if you take an example like that, I mean, to have a mission to do that, I mean, it would be hugely political, and it'd be very difficult for a government to actually have it, which is sort of interesting contrast with the idea of an independent bank. Do we have an independent sort of climate change sort of thing to change the economy by diktat towards a zero livestock economy? I mean, and how a lot of that will be, as we get away from the easy wins around climate change, etc., most of the stuff will be in that camp, I do. And does that mean a totally different way of doing industrial strategy?
Well, I think this is why I was trying to emphasise, we when we talk about this, try and emphasise the need to legitimise those missions by co-creating them with the public, with civil society groups, rather than just government just picking them out of the air. And that is the hard bit, I guess. Right? That's the messy bit. How do you actually do that practically? It is really challenging. We're sort of trying to do it on the UK industrial policy at the moment, by bringing together a group, but they are basically experts rather than civil society. But I think that's important. Otherwise, if it becomes politicised, the danger, I think, is that the mission just gets dropped when the next government comes in. Right?
But it worked perfectly for plastics. Suddenly, David Attenborough, bang!
Yeah.
Government policy changed overnight.
Yeah.
Let's have.
So I'm Angela Druckmann. So I think I'd like to go back to basics and what it's all for. So Victoria started off with who is it all for, and Josh, you've got the mission-oriented strategy, and we need to get away from this religion of it's all about GDP and money and things. It's what it's for. We need a plurality of indicators, and that's where it's all going wrong. And the same with the developing countries things. It's not all about profit and industries and which industries you can be in the front of the race for, or even trying to be in the race. It's what is well-being for the people of the country, the citizens of the countries we're talking about. And to be measuring it all by GDP or profit or wealth and things is just the wrong measurement. So we need to, go back to the, ICW, GPI, MNW, all these different sorts of indicators, and measure our industrial strategy against them, not against GDP.
People agree with that. Are you?
Yeah, I was very glad to hear about the bottom-up and this kind of approach. I'll declare interest here is that I'm pretty much a municipalist. I like Book Chin, I like all those good people. And this comes back to actually the previous thing, is that in the municipality, we've got a mismatch between the municipality and central government, and you're going to need to engage, according to you, civil society. And I'm just wondering how that will work out. You know, what the methods are, because normally when government engages civil society, it's usually to patronise it. Unhappily, I wish it were, that weren't so, but that's so. And also on from that, related to that, one investment bank or regional investment banks, because that's actually part of the same architecture.
Paul, last one, and then we'll give a chance to answer and wrap up.
Okay. Maybe what you're saying is much more radical than you are articulating, because you're almost like articulating as back to normal or back to something normal. So I think it's never been normal for banks to finance innovation. The KfW or China or wherever you look for banks, they're financing kind of copying many times. Germany does more than copy, but it's financing production more than innovation. So innovation has often, I believe, in the past been a kind of private venture rather than a public venture. I think a public investment bank is a good idea. I'm not against it.
Respond, and we'll wrap up and have a glass of wine, and we can continue the discussion after that.
I'd just like to make a point about regional dispersion. There was quite a lot of discussion about whether RBS should be broken up into regional banks, not just that the government should tell them what to do, but should in fact establish autonomous branches for regional purposes, which would go some way. It doesn't solve the problem altogether, of course, but it goes some way to answering your question. Poor old RBS had a rough time tonight.
And that would link to more of a sort of regional engagement that might be more practical.
I was just going to comment on your point on engaging with communities. I mean, one of the examples we often use is the German green revolution. Does anyone know the German word for it? Completely forgotten. Anyway,
the Germans are calling.
Yeah. Basically, it was this huge shift in Germany, and a lot of people say it came out of the accident in Japan, the nuclear accident in Japan, Fukushima, that led Merkel to take this, and then a lot of civil protest against nuclear within Germany that pushed Merkel to take this very strong stance on green subsidies. But what Germany did is they got, for example, the steel industry involved, including the trade unions, involved in discussing how do we decarbonise steel, right? At a very early stage, before anyone else in Europe was doing that. And they were hugely successful in doing that. So it was a sort of interaction between society, politicians, trade unions, commercial organisations that pushed this forward. I mean, and as I say, it's not a clear thing. It's those diagrams can make it all look very easy and clear, but it's not. It's messy, but it can be done. You need the right kind of politician to take advantage of those opportunities, I think. On the financing of innovation, the private sector can finance and does finance innovation. The point I was trying to make is that in the innovation chain, it's quite a long chain. You've got different types of investment, and that very early stage R&D that is very high risk. It's going to be failures. Some of it's not going to go anywhere, and you do need the state to play an important role there. And it can play an important role in product development later on down the chain. But the narrative that you hear is the state, the public sector doesn't know how to do this, so it should just step out of the way. And that there's no evidence actually.
I agree with you, but to take 25% of assets owned by KfW and then compare it to an innovation bank, I think is a misconception.
What's an innovation bank?
The public investment bank. Sorry, the general idea that the public sector needs to invest in innovation.
What I would say with a state investment bank, if it's going to be financially sustainable, then of course it has to have a diversified portfolio of assets. And of course it will invest in stuff that it knows will give it a decent return. But it will use that money to cross-subsidise the higher risk stuff. There's less incentive, I think, for the private sector to do that. There's more incentive for it to just put money in and get money out, right? So that's the difference. I'm not saying that you can have a financially sustainable public bank that only does the high risk investment. That wouldn't work.
Well, we've got the Green Investment Bank doing that very thing.
Sorry?
The Green Investment Bank is doing that very thing.
Yeah, which unfortunately has been privatised because it was seen as too successful. It's been successful, therefore we must turn it into a private corporation, otherwise it will defeat all the rules that we've been pushing forward for the last 30 years. And I totally agree on the indicators point, obviously. That would help a lot.
Tony, you want to say a last thing?
I just wanted to say, is there any movement in government to change them? Do we know?
Well, I think it's the whole sort of development of different indicators was quite sort of active during the noughties, actually, up to the sort of the crash, really, when there was much more focus on sustainable development. And I think things have gone on sort of slightly under the radar in ONS since, but it's lost any political interest, really. There's probably work going on, but in terms of political emphasis around there, it's non-existent.
Kind of
but then there's really no political emphasis on anything at the moment.
Except one thing.
Except one thing. So it's very difficult to make any judgments about what normality. If we ever return to normality, we will then be able to make some sort of judgment as to the nature of what governments are doing now, as opposed to in the past. Maybe that's too hopeful. Normality will never return.
Never be the same.
Never be the same. Get to a different normality. Is there any last comments you'd like to make before we wrap up, or do you think we've pretty much exhausted ourselves on this, or we need a glass of wine? I think we need a drink. Well, okay. With that, I would like to very much thank Vicky and Josh and everyone else for making a very good discussion. Thank you.